How did Immanuel Kant transform the way humans perceive not just the world around them, but how we all understand ourselves and our place in existence? Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is one of the most influential and difficult works in the history of philosophy, perhaps the greatest philosophical achievement since Aristotle and Plato. It completely changed how people think about knowledge. Kant was attempting to resolve a deep intellectual crisis that had emerged during the Enlightenment. Thinkers across Europe were engaged in a struggle with fundamental questions about the limits of reason, the possibility of metaphysical knowledge, and the conflict between science, philosophy, and religion. Kant believed, to solve this, he couldn't just offer another theory. He had to fundamentally rethink what knowledge itself is and what its limits must be. Kant was writing at a time when the Enlightenment was reaching its intellectual and cultural peak. Thinkers were questioning everything: the holders of absolute power, church authority and absolute monarchs, even basic ideas like truth, knowledge, and reality. The Renaissance had transformed the culture and ideological paradigm in the Western world over the previous centuries. Intellectual movements had spawned, and by Kant's time, the idea of an individualist society grounded in rational deliberation and freedom was becoming the dominant ideology. The Enlightenment was ripe for someone to fully express this ideological culmination of hundreds of years of thought. Traditional authorities were increasingly being questioned by the people they had once ruled over. Do we need political and religious authorities to tell us how to live or what to believe if we each have the capacity to figure these things out for ourselves? Kant expresses this Enlightenment commitment to the sovereignty of reason in the Critique. Our age is the age of criticism, to which everything must submit. But this raised a serious question. If everything must be judged by reason, what exactly can reason know? By the 18th century, European philosophy was broadly divided into two camps. On one side were the rationalists, such as Descartes and Leibniz, who believed that the way to learn about the fundamental structure of reality was by following the methods of mathematics and logic. They argued that human reason was a divine gift and that God guaranteed a correspondence between our logical thoughts and reality itself. On the other side were the empiricists, including David Hume, who argued that knowledge of the world comes primarily from sensory experience. What we see, hear, and observe is truth. According to Hume, all our ideas originate from these experiences, and we cannot form meaningful knowledge about reality without them. Hume divided knowledge into two types: relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas are necessarily true and can be known through reason alone, such as in mathematics or logic. For example, a geometric proof or an arithmetic truth does not depend on experience. Matters of fact, on the other hand, depend entirely on experience. A statement like, "It will rain tomorrow," can only be known by observing the world, and it can always turn out to be false. But Hume noticed a deeper problem. Claims like, "everything has a cause," don't fit neatly into either category. They are not logically necessary, but we also never directly observe causation itself. Imagine you're watching a game. You see the cue ball roll across the green felt and strike the 8 ball, which then begins to move. Hume points out that even if you watch this 1,000 times, you never actually see a power or force transfer from one ball to the other. All you see are two separate motions: event A, the cue ball moving, and event B, the 8 ball moving. Because your mind has seen this constant conjunction so often, it creates a mental shortcut or habit. You aren't using logic to conclude the second ball will move. Your brain is simply jumping ahead of the movie because it's a pattern you've seen before. If the cue ball hit the 8 ball and they both just vanished, or the cue ball bounced backward while the 8 ball stayed still, it wouldn't be a logical contradiction. It would just break the customary expectation your mind has built up. If causation isn't logically necessary and isn't directly observed, how can we claim to know anything about how the world will behave in the future? Into this area of conflict, Kant himself steps in to offer his critique of reason itself. Because this problem deeply unsettled Kant. His response to Hume was that he had been awakened from his dogmatic slumber by Hume's skepticisms which led him to fundamentally reappraise the relationship between the human mind and reality. Instead of assuming, as empiricists did, that our knowledge must match the world exactly as it is, Kant suggested something radical. The world we experience fits the way our mind works. He compares this to Nicholas Copernicus. Before Copernicus, people believed everything in the heavens revolved around the earth, but Copernicus showed that it is the earth that moves around the sun. And to understand the motion of the stars in our night sky, we also must consider our own movement. How things appear depends on our perspective. In that same way, Kant says that instead of assuming our mind just passively observes reality, we should think of the mind as actively shaping how we experience the world. So, the objects we experience follow the structure of our mind, not the other way around. Think about wearing blue-tinted glasses. Everything you see looks slightly blue, but the world itself isn't truly blue. The color comes from the glasses. Still, you can't see anything except through that filter. Kant is saying something similar. We don't experience the world exactly as it is. We experience it through the structure of our mind. The mind acts like a filter that shapes everything we perceive. So, what we know is the world as it appears to us, not necessarily the world as it exists independently of us. So, what are these filters? The most basic of these are space and time. Not concepts, but what Kant calls forms of intuition. They structure how anything can appear to us. Every object appears somewhere and at some moment because our mind structures it that way. On top of space and time, the mind applies deeper concepts known as categories of understanding. Kant groups these mental tools into categories like quantity, quality, and most importantly, relation and modality. Together, they form the complete framework that structures all possible experience. When you watch a cue ball hit another ball, it feels like you are just seeing reality as it is. However, Kant argues that your mind is building that experience using built-in filters called categories. You don't just see random colors. Your mind automatically organizes the scene into quantity, seeing one ball, then two, and quality, noticing their specific colors and speed. Most importantly, your mind applies the category of relation, which allows you to understand that the first ball caused the second to move, rather than it being a random coincidence. Finally, through modality, you grasp that this collision follows necessary physical laws rather than being a miracle. Since you can't actually see a cause, only the movement, it is your mind that provides the structure. Without these internal categories, the world would be a confusing, meaningless blur of disconnected sensations. In this way, Kant responds to Hume. We can know that every event has a cause, not because we observe it, but because the mind necessarily organizes experience in this way. Kant called this a synthetic a priori judgment. It means we can have knowledge that tells us how the world actually works, synthetic, but which is universally true without us needing to experience it first, a priori. We simply cannot experience events except through this framework. This leads to Kant's central idea, known as transcendental idealism. We experience only appearances, phenomena, not things as they are in themselves, noumena. Imagine looking at a rainbow. It appears as a colorful arc in the sky, located at a certain distance and position. However, the rainbow is not an object that exists in that exact place independently of us. It depends on the way light interacts with our eyes and how our mind structures that perception in space and time. According to Kant, what we experience here is not the thing that exists in itself, but the phenomenon, the appearance shaped by our perceptual framework. The actual reality behind it, the noumenon, remains inaccessible to us. For Kant, this is precisely what makes science possible. He argued that proper science requires a foundation in mathematics and a priori laws which allow us to understand phenomena, the world as it appears to human sensibility. However, he maintained that scientific knowledge is strictly limited to these appearances and can never access noumena, or experience things as they exist in themselves. To Kant, The scientist's role is to organize empirical observations under a systematic, unified framework of laws, utilizing the regulative principles of reason to treat nature as if it were a coherent, purposeful whole. But Kant doesn't stop here. Once he explains how experience is structured, he asks a deeper question. Human reason naturally seeks the ultimate answers. Ultimate questions being the tracks that lead us to the conclusion of the ultimate answers. Our minds want to understand the ultimate questions, such as whether the universe had a beginning or whether God exists. When our minds try to use these mental tools to answer these ultimate questions, we hit dead ends and contradictions. We can't know the answers because we are trying to apply the mind's filters to things beyond the limits of possible experience. We cannot use pure reason to prove or disprove things like God, the soul, or free will. In this sense, he says he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Kant's critique of pure reason represents a profound transformation in philosophy. By shifting the focus from objects to the contradictions of cognition, Kant redefined the nature of knowledge. He shows that while we cannot know things as they are in themselves, we can understand the structures that shape our experience. This allows him to reconcile the insights of rationalism and empiricism, resolve the crisis of metaphysics, and lay the foundation of modern philosophy, and allow us to start on the next step of human intellectual development after the centuries of absolutism.